Attention WFIA members, the 2024 WFIA Virtual Convention will be this fall from September 13th through September 15th online. Scheduled to appear are the world's strongest man, Ken Patera, the world's most dangerous announcer, Gary Michael Capetta, Bill Apter, the High Flyers, Greg Gagne and Jumpin' Jim Brunzell, and just recently signed, luscious Lars Anderson, otherwise known as Larry Hynemi, and there's more coming. Folks, watch for our prices on our Facebook page and WFIA.org. Prices will be out soon. If you are not a WFIA member, you will be paying an additional fee. Go to WFIA.org and become a member today. Welcome to another edition of Bumps and Thumps, the talk of wrestling. I'm Brian Ferguson. Folks, we got a special treat for you today. My good friend, wrestling icon, historian, if you will. Here he is, Mr. George Schire. George, we got a treat for these. We've got a treat for these fans today. We're going to talk about, and this one is for our friend Ralph Harkey.
Yeah.
Our one of our WFIA board members now. He asked that we talk about this. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and we're going to talk about who today?
Well, we are going to talk about the Nature Boy. Well, not that Nature Boy.
Not that one.
We are going to talk about the original Nature Boy, and that is Buddy Rogers.
That's right. Buddy Rogers, really one of the first innovators, if you will. He was duplicated by, Flair, Buddy Landell, Roger Kirby, just a multitude of people. And he had such an influence on the business. A lot of people, some people didn't like him, but he put butts in seats, if you will. So
yeah.
Let's talk about him a little bit. And go ahead, George. Just go ahead what you were about to say there.
Well, and you kind of started it off, Brian, because when you said he was often imitated. And one thing that, we can look back at the kayfabe era, the era of so many territories, so many wrestlers, and most often every wrestler at some point was imitated. You mentioned the Nature Boy Ric Flair. Yeah, he would admit this. He stole a lot from Buddy Rogers, as did Nature Boy Roger Kirby. He was billed as Nature Boy Roger Kirby for some time during his career. And there were others, like you said, Buddy Landell, etc. But, we'll also point out that even guys like Superstar Graham and Hulk Hogan and Jesse Ventura, who themselves imitated Superstar Graham, but all three of them collectively were in a roundabout kind of way an imitation of the original Buddy Rogers. And Buddy himself.
Hello, everyone. This is Brian Ferguson, the host of Bumps and Thumps, the talk of wrestling. I want to tell you about a new podcast out called Falls Count Anywhere. It is a classic pro wrestling podcast that brings you the legends of wrestling with true wrestling fans Chris DiCarlo and Charlie Turner. They bring on guests that are legends in this business, and as well as wrestlers of today, promoters, referees, you name it. They have them on there, folks. And I encourage you to listen to them. If you're on YouTube, watch them. They drop every Saturday. They have their podcast. They drop it in the afternoon. So look forward to that podcast coming out. Falls Count Anywhere podcast with Chris DiCarlo and Charlie Turner. Folks, you will not be disappointed. I guarantee it. And enjoy the podcast.
He took this newfound gimmick of his, and he will admit that a lot of his ideas came from Gorgeous George. So it's kind of and then it's just a succession, a set of dominoes that just keep falling. But one of the things that I'm always reminded of is that imitation is the greatest form of flattery. And I don't think we could give all of the guys I mentioned any credit for being good as they were in their roles if we didn't start with the originator, in this case, of the Buddy Rogers strut. Oh man. And the arrogance, there are some small clips out there that he'll be going about his interview and he'll make some comment that to a nicer guy it couldn't happen.
Yeah.
I mean, he was, and he wasn't a shouter per se. I'm not saying he never had an interview where he, maybe blew up a little bit, but he wasn't a shouter. He wasn't screaming at the camera. He was in there more telling you that he was good and he could back it up. And you come to see, I'm going to take care of your baby face or whoever it is, Yeah. So Buddy was so good. It's interesting too that Buddy, he was in the business. You talk about some of these guys that were in the early 80s that transitioned into the expansion era, and they kind of went, in both eras, kayfabe and then later. Well, Buddy Rogers, he started wrestling in 1944.
Oh, okay.
Think about that. In my results records, I have him 1944 was, I think, his first match, and he wrestled. He actually wrestled a guy who was a huge name in that era, Baron, and I never know how to pronounce his name, if it's like Michael or Michelle or Michael, but it's Baron. I'm going to say Michelle Leon.
Leon, yeah.
And if you look that guy up, he was main event back then. And later on too, I mean, going forward, he was main event. He was a top draw. He was a colorful character. Well, in February of 44, a guy named Buddy Rose, geez, he was kind of an imitator too, a little bit bigger, no pun intended. Buddy Rogers, he wasn't always using the name Buddy Rogers though. A lot of people would be surprised to know that in some of his earlier matches, now this is going to be one maybe for a lot of people, in a lot of his early matches, he actually was billed as Dusty Rhodes.
Really? I did not know that.
Yeah, think about that. And the reason he was billed as Dusty Rhodes was Buddy Rogers' real name was Herman Rhode, Rohde. And he got billed as Dusty Rhodes. Now here's even a little bit interesting tidbit behind that one. Before Buddy used the name of Buddy Rogers, Herman Rhodes' brother actually wrestled for a very short time, his brother John, and brother John wrestled in some matches as Buddy Rogers.
Oh,
what do you think of that?
Wow. Yeah, a little flip-flopping going on.
There you go. There you go. But Dusty Rhodes was really one of the original names of Buddy Rogers. Got me to thinking too when I thought about that. And in fact, right before we went on the air, I asked my wife, I said, would you look up something for me from the Major League Baseball world? Because I remembered in the back of my mind that there was a Major League Baseball player that was called Dusty Rhodes. And for what it's worth for the Major League Baseball players, and I know we're not talking Dusty Rhodes here, but this kind of ties in.
Yeah. Right.
A guy named, I wrote it down on this one here. I wrote this down. James Lemire, aka Dusty Rhodes. He was Major League Baseball player for the New York Giants from 1952 to 1957, and he went back to them in 1959. They, of course, moved to San Francisco. The Giants did.
Right.
And this James Lemire, who was Dusty Rhodes in baseball, he was had a key part in the 1954 New York Giants, and that's on my little piece of paper that I wrote down.
There you go.
So there you go.
Yeah. Hey everyone, this is Brian Ferguson. Fans of the AWA, you are in for a real treat. My friend Joyce Poston has just released her book titled My Ringside Seat to the AWA. Joyce writes about her personal experiences with wrestlers such as Nick Bockwinkel, Lord Alfred Hayes, Baron Von Raschke, and others. Joyce also has published many photos from her collection that you will not see anywhere else. Order today by email at joyce.poston@gmail.com. Payment is through PayPal. The book is only $20 plus $6 shipping and handling. International orders, please email Joyce for shipping charge. Folks, run, don't walk to your keyboard, and order today. And enjoy the podcast. We got some photos that George had.
Let's put a picture up of Buddy. I think this first picture is so awesome.
Oh, yeah, it is. It's great. Let's see if we can get it up here. Well, we're going to have to go back a little bit, my friend. We can do that. There we go. Right
there we go. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Now, that picture also graced the cover of one of the Wrestling Review magazine photo albums back in the 60s. Okay. And you'll notice Buddy here, and we're a little bit ahead of ourselves with that, but he is wearing very proudly the NWA Wrestling World Championship belt.
Yes.
And boy, you look at the tan. He just had the body, the build, the look, and as we said, the strut. Started wrestling, like I said, though, Brian, during World War II. World War II went from 1942 to 46, and Buddy started wrestling during that time period, and he wrestled for what was it, about 24 years, his whole career. So that takes him into the later part of the 60s a little bit there. Well, early part of the 60s, 20 years. Mm-hmm. But from the get-go, a guy who was an innovator, as we said, he understood how to work the crowd. He understood that if he bleached his hair blonde, if he would, and I talk about that strut because I only had the honor of seeing Buddy on tape, and there's not a lot of tape out there, sadly. But if someone goes to YouTube, there are some clips from the later 50s, and I mean clips, they're very short. There's an interview out there that I think uses that line I said that it couldn't happen to a better guy, it couldn't happen to, or something like that.
Yeah.
And then there's one match where he was going to be going against Crusher Lisowski back in the early 60s. So Buddy Rogers, just an innovator. And one of the things that really made him different from that World War II going forward after the war is, we had wrestlers, Brian, that were wrestlers, with the exception of Gorgeous George. You had your Luthez and guys like him that they got in that ring and they made it a contest. Yeah, you had a bad guy who would bend the rules, but you had the Luthez, who was the one the fans cheered for. And when a guy like Rogers comes along, boy, I'll tell you what, that's, to use the common catchphrase out there, that was a game changer.
Yeah.
So one of the things when I mentioned Luthez, and this really has always been in my head, Lou had a great deal of respect for Buddy Rogers because, and he said it in his own words, Brian, he said, Buddy was a draw at the gate.
Right.
But in saying that, Lou appreciated the fact that Buddy could put those butts in the seats, as you alluded to.
Yeah.
But at the same time, Lou, because he started wrestling, back in 1927 or something. I don't know I can't remember the exact year. But he was a guy who didn't go for those gimmicks, didn't go for the fancy. You've got a picture there of Rogers in one of his ultimate sequin jackets. Put that one up.
Yep, I got you right
there. Look at that jacket.
Yeah.
And I mean, I wish this was a color picture, because this is a jacket with gold and sequins and loud colors on it. And this was something that Lou Thez didn't go for.
Right.
And you add to the fact that, look at that profile. Buddy was a pretty boy and the braggart. So even though Lou, and the reason I love talking about this part of it is when I was attending Cauliflower Alley back in the early 2000s, I sat on the board of directors because I was on it for a while, and Lou Thez was still the president of the Cauliflower Alley. Okay. And oh man, I never had the opportunity in years earlier to talk with him. And of course, Lou's career was long over at that point. But I had the opportunity to sit down with him a couple of times and just talk about some of the little historical tidbits. One of them being this rivalry and this interaction he had with Buddy Rogers. And so he respected, and this came from him. He said, I respected Buddy Rogers because he was a draw. He said, but my problem with Buddy Rogers is I didn't like putting over a gimmick wrestler, a character. That was Lou's words. And it wasn't that Buddy was the great technical worker like Lou Thez was. Buddy was a gimmick. Buddy was a character. And he could get in that ring. And in most cases, I'm not saying he didn't have any wrestling talent at all, but in most cases, he needed a good opponent to make him look better so that he could do the things that irritated the fans. And that was and in the scheme of it all, Brian, that was the perfect scenario. Because when you had a Lou Thez versus Buddy Rogers, ultimate, I mean, it was box office. Number one, you had Lou Thez, who in his own right was box office, because he was, as I always use the term, the real deal. And then you had this mockery to the fans' eyes, this mockery of the business, this guy who can't wrestle, this guy who has to cheat, this guy has to use a foreign object. And, he's bragging about how great he is all the time. Well, that's the formula. And that is what made Buddy Rogers the success that he was.
Did you ever wonder what could have been with the AWA had things gone differently? Had their fortunes gone differently? Had certain wrestlers not left and perhaps more money would have been at the disposal of the Gagnes? Well, wonder no further. You can go to Brad Drake's YouTube channel and experience the 1987 Supermod for yourself, as Brad Drake starts off in May 1987, along with Greg Gagne, Baron Von Raschke, Vern Gagne himself, Nick Bockwinkel, Larry Zbyszko, Kurt Hennig, and a slew of others as he plays and saves the AWA.
Hey everyone, this is Brian Ferguson. I want to tell you about a great book written by my good friend, Mr. George Schire. It's called Minnesota's Golden Age of Wrestling from Vern Gagne to the Road Warriors. George dives deep into the golden age of wrestling, starting with the 1950s, talking about Lou Thez, Vern Gagne, Wilbur Schneider, and many others, and goes all the way deep into the AWA and into the 1980s, ending with the tag team domination of the Road Warriors. Now, this book includes photos of George's personal collection, as well as programs and sports facts that was published for many years. So go to Amazon today or the Minnesota Historical website and get this book as soon as you can. And folks, enjoy the podcast.
There's another picture you have of a different, I think it's a different jacket. There you go.
Yeah, Nature Boy.
Oh my. when you look at those jackets in the day, he'd
Yeah.
come down the aisle with that and strut in the ring with it. I mean,
Yeah.
that was so cool.
Yeah. I never saw him obviously live. I wasn't around then, but you look at those matches that are on YouTube, and he was such an innovator. Yes, he borrowed per se some characteristics of others, like you said, Gorgeous George, and I'm sure a few others. But this guy was really the first guy, in my opinion, to really be emulated by others.
Yeah.
There's the Luthez, he had this suit and tie, and people did that. But I'm talking about, you said Luzo didn't like characters, but this guy, Buddy Rogers, George, just emulated sarcasm, emulated I'm better than you.
Yep.
Everybody is inferior to me. And it just sold. People loved it.
Yep.
And I just, I don't think he gets the credit sometimes that he really deserves. He's one of really the true pioneers of wrestling of today, that character. Well, Gorgeous George was too, but I'm saying him as well.
Well, and the thing is too, we've talked on previous podcasts about the advent of television in the late 40s. Around 1948, 49, and 50, television was really a novelty at that point. It was something new. And, we had these little postage size stamps, TV screens with the snow going through them and the antenna and the picture was, the sound wasn't the greatest. But they were so innovative. And we've talked about guys that made television quite the commodity that it was early on.
Right.
Wrestling. That was a draw on early television. And we've talked about the famous Dumont Network out of Chicago. And they were a national hookup, one of the first national broadcasting systems. So when they used wrestling, even though we had fewer territories in the wrestling business back then, we still had territories. But the Dumont Network, it brought those territorial wrestlers to light, especially the names like Luthez and Killer Kowalski and Yukon Eric and Buddy Rogers and Gorgeous George. Hans Schmidt was in there, and Vern Gagne. These were the guys that all of a sudden, if you lived in Florida, you knew Vern Gagne. If you lived in California, you knew Buddy Rogers, who was from New Jersey. And it was so important. So it's a small list of guys that were those national names back when wrestling wasn't even national. Because then we got to the territorial system as it evolved through the 50s and through the 60s, 70s, where all of a sudden you got 25, 30 territories and everybody has their, and you don't get to see anybody else except who's on your TV in your town. So Buddy Rogers can hold that. And when you talk about those imitators, we can even take a guy, and Ray admitted this, and I'm talking about Ray. Later on, he's Ray the Crippler Stevens. But Ray Stevens actually took the blonde hair and the in his early years, Ray would wear sequined ring jackets. He didn't have Ray didn't have the charisma that Buddy had. Ray was the gruffer, more the bully type wrestler, but Ray copied him. And Johnny Valentine, oh my gosh, Johnny Valentine, he was one of the real deals in the business. He was one of the stiffer wrestlers, but guys like Luthez and Vern Gagne and Pat O'Connor and all these guys, they'll tell you that Johnny Valentine got a lot of his shtick in his early years. Johnny wrestled with a guy named Chet Wallach, and they wrestled as a tag team in the late 57, 58. They were here in my Twin Cities for a while, in fact.
Okay.
And they wrestled as a tag team. They come in with these pink boas on and pink tights. Okay, seriously.
Yeah.
And they were
I
both
believe it.
blondes. I've got pictures of them. I wish I had sent you one of those. But we didn't plan on talking about Johnny Valentine, so I didn't know. But
Yeah.
that was an imitation, so to speak, because the strutting with the boas and the pink tights, but the blonde hair, and they called themselves the Atomic Blondes.
Ah, yes.
It's and they held our title for a while here, the old Upper Midwest Tag Team Championship, and then it was also the National Wrestling Alliance Championship in Minneapolis for a short time. But
Right.
yeah, another one of those guys that took from another wrestler. So going on with Buddy, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
He was a guy that was a proven commodity at the box office. You know, we put Buddy Rogers on the marquee. Guess what, kids? We got tickets sold. And it didn't matter sometimes who his opponent was, though he was usually a main event guy. I mean, he was in the main event. And this was before his championship years. And as time progressed with Buddy, obviously the National Wrestling Alliance had come along in 1949 when the whole group of promoters got together down in Waterloo, Iowa, and had this unification of their promotional talents to have one world champion. Well, we know Lou Thesz became the first one. And he became the first National Wrestling Alliance champion again, because in those days, the rationale was that the champion, the world champion, should be a guy that can wrestle, should be a guy that carries himself, like you alluded to, wearing the suit and tie when he's in town. And he comes out on the interview looking dignified, not some, and I mean, I hate to digress and go way into today's world champions, but some of these guys look like they just came out of a homeless shelter. You know, they're all ragged and they don't look anything like, you know, and you get my drift. So
no, I get it. Yeah.
Lou really was that epitome of what they thought at the time going into the 50s, what a world champion should be. Well, part of the problem with Lou then, as we talked about, Buddy Rogers was obviously a draw, and Lou would wrestle against Buddy. But Lou's condition was, I will never let Buddy beat me. And Lou had the clout and the respect and the commitment to the promoters that he could get away with this. So anytime he met Buddy Rogers would get title shots for the NWA title. He had a couple of them, 3-4 of them against Lou Thesz. And there might be more without looking at my results, but but it was always, you know, at the time you thought, well, maybe Buddy can do this. That was the believability, the suspension of disbelief, and the way they promoted it. But in the end result, Lou wouldn't put him over if they gave him any amount of money. He just was not. And it wasn't just Buddy Rogers. It was any, as Lou referred to them, gimmick wrestler or character wrestler. He wasn't going to put him over for the title. So that's how that rivalry went. Now, if we move forward a little bit, we've talked in the past, Brian, how Lou, when in 1957, when he decided he needed to time off, he wanted some away from the ring or a lesser schedule, he handpicked Dick Hutton, who was a great amateur wrestler, and again, like Lou himself, a wrestler, to be his successor. And the only problem was, as we've talked about, Dick Hutton, God bless him, he was as bland and dry and boring as you could sit on your front lawn and watch it grow. He was just boring. And so after only 2 years, even a little bit less, the NWA contingent, they said, we got it. He's not drawing. His name isn't marquee like Lou's was. We need to get the title off of him. And it was a consensus. In a way, a slam to Dick Hutton, but in a way, he was the NWA world champion and had his run, and that's great. So he lost it. He lost it to Pat O'Connor. Now, by 1961, or by 1959, Pat O'Connor was probably the closest thing you were going to come to a Lou Thez at that time. Remembering, of course, that Lou Thez, Lou was born in the early 20s, or he was born in the right before the turn of the century. Lou was old by wrestling standards. Okay. Yeah. Although the guy could still, I don't know that I'd have wanted to mess with him when he was at Cauliflower and he was 83, 4, 5, whatever he was.
Yeah.
I don't think I'd have wanted to mess with him because he'd hand me my arm as he's talking to me. So, but they put it on Pat O'Connor, which was a good thing. Pat turned out to be a good draw as world champion. Pat had the same feeling as Lou did. He wore the suits, ties, carried the championship with dignity. He was a clean-cut wrestler, and he made a perfect opponent for all of the characters, heels, etc. out there. As was the case, though. By the time we got to 1961, Pat was starting to get tired. Pat was looking to, I can take a break from this. And he got involved a little bit in the Central States promotional area. So he'd already been in the business since the late 40s. Pat O'Connor had. By the way, he got some of his early training, strangely enough, from Vern Gagne and Joe Pazendak. So
there you go.
Pat had the oats to get into the ring.
Right.
So, but Pat wanted some time off. Now here's where it was getting interesting. Our friend Buddy Rogers was still drawing like crazy.
Yeah.
He was being controlled a little bit more, though, and I don't know if the word controlled is the best word.
Right.
But he was being booked more often than not on the East Coast. And this is still several years before WWF.
Right.
In fact, it was even a little bit before Capital Sports, which was the original company of the WW, etc. F.
Right.
So Buddy was, more often than not getting more attention from the East Coast. But the NWA agreed that it might be a good idea. Let's put the title on Buddy Rose. Buddy Rose. Get out of my head. Buddy Rogers. Paul Pershman's haunting me today. My buddy Paul Pershman. Oh, I'm sorry about that. Buddy Rogers.
That's all right.
They realized that Buddy was drawing, and that was key, and bottom line is any promoter of any stature, they would want a person that can draw them money. The money is the main deal. It didn't matter if the guy couldn't wrestle, if he wrestled like a broomstick. If he drew money, they wanted to have him on their cards. So Buddy really, because of his character, his gimmick, his charisma, his drawing power, he got the NWA world title. Now, here's where it gets interesting, Brian. Even though Buddy was a good draw, even though Buddy was doing what the NWA wanted, it started to become a power play as his title reign went on. And the power play was coming from his booking agents out there in the East Coast. I know that I always refer to him as Daddy Vince, but that was Vince McMahon Sr. And his cohorts of Toots Mondt and, I always forget the other guy. It'll come to me later. but they were kind of controlling Buddy Rogers, and you'd see Buddy Rogers appearing in a lot of the East Coast matches, and then the promoters in the NWA other territories, they weren't able to get him for dates. And the more this became a problem, the more the NWA promoters in all these other cities, and these promoters had paid dues. They had a right to have the champion on their cards.
Right.
It became more of a problem. And eventually, the old push comes to shove. They have their annual meeting, and it pretty much comes down to, we're going to get the title off of Buddy Rogers. But the question was agreeing on somebody that can do it or will do it.
Yeah.
And again, you have to have the consensus. Well, the only consensus they didn't have was that group of East Coast promoters, for the most part. And they decided to go make the phone call to a guy who had at that point been kind of semi-retired, and that was Lou Thez. And Lou was the guy, and the reason that his name came up was for exactly what I said just a few minutes ago. Lou was the real deal, and Lou could go into the match and wrestle Buddy and take the title from him, even if Buddy didn't want him to. And that was the key thing back in that era, Brian. Most of the champions throughout the NWA history and even in the AWA history, the champions were usually guys that, if they needed to, they could defend themselves to keep the title and not let some challenger get a quick pin or something goofy. And that's why it was important to have the wrestler on there. So they got a hold of Lou.
Yeah.
And, we want you to take the title off of Buddy. Well, I already told you about the rivalry between Lou and Buddy. Lou at that point wasn't really totally excited about taking the title back because, again, boy, I'll tell you what, Lou was well into his 50s, maybe even closer to 60 by that time. I don't know. I have to look at his birth date. I think it was the early 1900s. So he was, well into his upper years, but he agreed. Okay. So Buddy's having a fit. He doesn't want to wrestle Lou and give the title up to Lou. And again, though they respected each other, that was the rivalry, that Buddy knew that he couldn't beat Lou if he wanted to in a real match. And Lou knew that Buddy couldn't beat him if he tried all day. So what it came down to, and this is a famous thing that I'm sure some fans have heard, but Lou basically, because Buddy was protesting and the East Coast promoters were protesting, and this gets into 1963, and I'm going to go back a little bit in time in a moment, but in 1963, it was decided that Buddy was going to drop the title to Lou Thez. The East Coast promoters didn't like it, but what happened is Lou knew his instructions, take the title.
Right.
Buddy's instructions, he thought, were, I don't have to lose if I don't want to, but I can't beat Lou Thez. So the old story, and this is true, Lou went into the locker room, sat down next to Buddy Rogers, and he basically said it this way. He said, Buddy, tonight, we can do it the easy way or we can do it the hard way. Yeah. And it doesn't get any more clarified than that. And Buddy knew where he stood. He had to drop the title to Lou because the hard way was going to be that Lou was going to break him in half and he wouldn't be wrestling at all. End of story. So that's how it happened. But what happened is it was a one fall match. And the East Coast complained that Buddy couldn't lose the title or Lou couldn't, not the East Coast. The NWA said Lou's not going to lose the title in a one fall match. Buddy's not going to win it in a one fall match. So when Lou wins, the East Coast promoters said, we're going to still recognize Buddy Rogers as
Buddy.
champion. There was that split. And this goes back to what was now Capital Sports, but the Worldwide Wrestling Federation was now being formed. And they had declared to their fans, East Coast base, that there were a couple different stories. One of them was that Buddy had not lost the title to Lou Thez, and so they were still recognizing him. But another version is that Buddy had won the title in Rio de Janeiro. And, that was one of those phantom title switches. So Buddy was now WWF champion. But here's the tough part. While this was happening, Buddy had a heart attack. Now, there's been speculation over the years that whether or not that was real or not, the problem is that when we're talking wrestling, there's always that little, are they ribbing us? Are they working us? But Buddy supposedly had a heart attack and he was in the hospital. And ironically, this was the time when the WWF had groomed for at least the last year or two Bruno Sammartino, and he had been main eventing for them since like 1959, and Bruno was over. And we've talked about that. The East Coast being in an ethnic populated area with largely Italian base at that point, a lot of Puerto Ricans and but Italians. And so Bruno was the natural, and he was over as a baby based on his strength and his he had his babyface charisma. So they signed a match between him and Rogers, who was the champion, for only a few days or a week or whatever it was. Rogers, the story goes, couldn't wrestle because of the heart attack. So he basically came into the ring as the champion. Bruno won the match in like 47 seconds or something. And I don't know if it's 40 something. He won the match.
It was quick.
It was a quickie. And the fans, they were elated. This was great. And Bruno, of course, then went on to his almost 8-year uninterrupted WWF title reign to January of 71. So that's how that all unfolded. Now, I always thought it was interesting with Buddy because I think on one of our podcasts, Brian, we talked about how, in fact, Lou Thez was involved in this too, but when Edward Carpentier had defeated Lou Thez in a one-fall match that was scheduled to be a 2 out of 3, and Lou had supposedly hurt his back in the match. This was in 1957, in June of 57. And Lou had supposedly hurt his back. The match couldn't continue. Well, the NWA said that, and ironically, Carpentier had won the first fall, the only fall. So what happened in that was there was that break off of some promoters that recognized Carpentier as champion, and they were billing him as NWA champion. And then when Lou was healed up, he was wrestling, and for a short time, Sam Muchnick, the AWA conglomerate, they allowed this to happen for a while. And then eventually, there were really 2 NWA champions. Although we point this out, Carpentier never got officially recognized by the NWA, and he's not included in their ranking of champions. Okay. So, but anyway, going back to Lou Thez again. So Buddy Rogers beats Lou Thez, but technically he didn't beat him. But here was one of those things that I thought was interesting. And this one took place, about it happened in the end of October of 62. So Rogers was champion. He loses a match in Montreal because of a broken ankle to Killer Kowalski. And the only thing I can say about the broken ankle thing is if it was an angle and it wasn't real, Rogers did not wrestle. This broken ankle thing in Montreal took place against Killer. It was either like November 1st or October 31st or something, right there. Rogers did not wrestle until December 26th or something after Christmas. So there was a good 2 months off. Okay.
Yeah.
But he's NWA champion still, supposedly, except in one city. And that city was Houston, Texas. Morris Siegel, who was the promoter in Houston at the time, because of that Montreal match, he began to recognize Killer Kowalski. And darn, I should have sent you the program covers, but from a November, I can't remember the exact date. The November program, they're announcing Killer Kowalski as the new NWA champion due to his defeat over Buddy Rogers, who suffered a broken ankle.
Oh.
And again, Buddy isn't officially wrestling, so it might have been a real broken ankle or just enough to keep him out of the ring for a while. We don't know.
Right.
Well, Killer is recognized as champion. Now, here's the irony of this. Buddy is recognized as, or Killer Kowalski is recognized and billed as the National Wrestling Alliance World Champion. He defended the title in Houston to Lou Thez. Lou is brought in. Now, Lou and Kowalski, oh my gosh, they had some great matches over the years. Lou said that he always enjoyed working with Killer Kowalski. You know, Killer Kowalski, we know he was a draw because after all, he was a killer. You know, he deliberately tried to take and kill Yukon Eric 10 years earlier, you know, and took his ear off. And that was real. So he got this killer name and he was a great draw. Well, so the irony of it that I always found interesting was that you got at least 3 Houston programs, and Houston used to run every Friday night. We've pointed that out before. For years, Friday night was Houston wrestling, uninterrupted, unless it was on Christmas Eve, that rare occasion when Christmas Eve would fall on a Friday every 6 years or 7 years or whatever it is. So anyway, he wrestled against Lou Thez in one of the Houston title defenses, Killer Kowalski did. And the story in the program, it's talking about Lou as a former NWA champion, you know, 3-4 times. And he's the guy that can beat Killer and take the title. And, you know, this is the match of the century, fans. I mean, it's all written up there. So Lou, who was Mr. NWA, was actually buying into this. And I'm sure they paid him well, but, and again, Sam Muchnick and company, they had to go along with this. But again, officially, Killer Kowalski was never and is never listed as being an NWA world champion, though in Houston, he did have that ranking. What's interesting is that I go back to saying, you know, when I do title histories, that Buddy Rogers, Killer Kowalski situation, I put an asterisk by Killer Kowalski, because you try to tell those fans for 3 weeks in Houston that attended those matches and got those programs and watched their television strutting Killer Kowalski as champion, you tell them that he didn't hold the title. You can't, because they can say, honestly, he did, even though the NWA doesn't include it. So I always liked that story. But then we had Buddy Rogers, man, he lost the title to Lou, and Lou went on to hold it, as we know, for 3 years. Until he lost it in '66 to Gene Kiniski, the NWA title. And that was pretty much the end for Lou Thez as far as a wrestler, though he did hang around. '66, he lost it to Gene Kiniski. He came Lou came to the AWA in 1967 and worked for Vern. And they had a couple of matches where they never outwardly said AWA or NWA in the Minneapolis programs, but the storyline was Lou Thez is here to challenge Vern Gagne, and the comment made by Lou was, I hope Vern Gagne isn't holding a grudge against me because I dodged him when I was world champion. And I've got a program to prove that. So, and they did have a couple matches. I will say in those matches, Vern got over because it was his company.
It was his company.
But by then, Lou and Vern, they had a great deal of respect. And I know we're talking about Buddy here, but I do want to share that at an early Cauliflower Alley club, in fact, it was the very first one that was held in Newton, Iowa, when the Cauliflower Club had their reunion at the opening of the Hall of Fame in Newton, Iowa. And Lou Thez and Vern Gagne were the first inductees into the George Tragos Lou Thez Museum. I personally had the opportunity to talk to both Vern and Lou, which I hold dearly to my heart about their rivalry. But I have, I think, 4 or 5 pictures. They both got into the small makeshift ring that was in the Newton, Iowa Hall of Fame. Both Vern and Lou got into the ring, and they were in their suits, but they got into their wrestling poses like they were going to go at each other. And then and I got pictures of this.
That's awesome.
And it was so beautiful to me because then they shook hands there, and it was like, wow, this is back in 1999. And I was like a little kid in the candy store watching this, because both of them, though I would honestly say neither of them were my own personal all-time favorite wrestlers. I loved them. I appreciated them. And I just had nothing but the utmost respect for them. So Buddy Rogers, let's stay on top.
Buddy Rogers. Yes.
And so pretty much he quit wrestling. He was done wrestling, after this 63 thing. We know that he had some other health issues throughout the years. And he ended up, I don't remember the year that he died.
He did some managing for a while too with Snuka and those guys. And
he came back. He came back in the later 70s there, and he was even kind of doing maybe the possible challenge to Ric Flair with a figure 4 leg lock. And we should point that out when we talk about that imitation is the greatest form of flattery thing. Ric Flair took the figure 4 leg lock from Buddy Rogers. That was Buddy's signature hold. And I'd point out that hold by Buddy was also copied by guys like Dick Beyer, the Destroyer, Johnny Powers, Reggie Parks, Billy Red Lyons, and there were others, but those are some prominent names. And of course, Ric Flair. So they copied that hold from Buddy Rogers. But he did some managing. If my memory serves me correctly, and I wasn't following it as close by that time, but I do recall that there was going to be and you might be able to help me on this. Was it Buddy Rogers scheduled to wrestle Flair, or was it Buddy going to wrestle Buddy Landell or somebody like that?
No, it was Flair. It was Flair. It was like 79. 79, 80, around that time frame. They did a match. I know Flair did a lot of the work from just watching it. You can watch it on YouTube. Buddy was,
he was not healthy and he was old.
He wasn't healthy. And so Flair basically, carried the match, but they had a match, and who was the real Nature Boy, and then he did some managing, like you said. And Buddy died in 92. He was only 71 years old.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
71.
he died in
And,
92. I
that's
just looked
and
it
that's
up.
a year older than me, so he was a youngster.
Yeah, he was. I
Hey,
mean, even yeah. Go ahead.
we talked. I want to go back now a little bit. Like I said, we'd kind of backtrack
Yeah,
a little bit too, because I
yeah,
love this when it's just kind of free flowing and we just kind of
yeah,
are.
yeah, yeah.
So
Me
we
too.
were talking about the Pat O'Connor match when Buddy Rogers
Ah,
took the
yes,
title. I sent you a picture, and
you did.
this is a picture that's been out there. It was on the cover, the back cover of a wrestling review magazine of Comiskey Park.
Yep,
You
yep.
put
I'm
that
gonna
up
pull it
there.
up right there.
There. This is
Yep.
just as it says, it's an unforgettable night because in Comiskey Park, which was the old Major League Baseball park for the Chicago White Sox back then,
Yep.
and the ring was out there on the infield, and you can see the crowd. This was a record setter. It says the attendance on there. Wasn't it 38,000? I can't read it exactly.
38,622.
And that was, to that point in time, the largest wrestling crowd that had
Yeah.
seen a major league wrestling match. So that
Wow.
tells you the drawing power of both Pat O'Connor being the champion
Yep.
at this point
Yeah.
for 2 years, and then also the charisma, the character, the drawing power of Buddy Rogers. I will point out that in this match, that was also a record gate dollar amount. And what does it say?
Yeah.
141,000 something?
$141,345.
Yeah. Now, the thing is, some of our newbie people today, they're going to say, well, that sure wasn't a lot of money back then. That didn't seem like a lot of money. Well, again, I always remind you, keep the era in mind that, though the paydays for these guys weren't like the paydays they are today, remember that back in 1961, when this took place, the average annual household income in America was about $10,000 to $12,000 a year. Household income. So you were buying tickets for $2, $3, or $4, and that was huge.
Yeah, that's a lot of money back then.
Or maybe, I don't think they were up to $5 at that point. So you say, well, geez, those ticket prices, they sure are great. Well, sure they are. Today, back then, that was the same as buying a $200, $300 ticket today. See? So I always tell people, please keep that in mind. So this was a record setter. And this, Brian, was done long before Vince McMahon Jr. ever dreamed of his Pontiac Silverdome WrestleMania 3 when he had was reported 70-some thousand fans or whatever it was.
78,000. There's two numbers. There's a 93,000.
Yeah, there is. They can't even agree on a number.
There's
this
two
was
numbers.
The real deal. And I will point out that this match took place in June for Rogers winning the title. They did have a rematch between Rogers and O'Connor. Without checking, I think there was only the one match. I don't think they met after that. They may have, but the rematch, which took place, I believe it was September, and of 61, and it was in Chicago. So that was considered the rematch. And in those days, that made sense because that was the soonest you could get the champion to come back in because he was traveling all over the country. And it was real in those days that way.
Yeah.
So they had a rematch, and that match also drew in excess of 30,000 fans. Wow. So that was a big deal. And Buddy Rogers, rest his soul, he can lay claim to having that on his historic notes.
Yeah.
The bottom line is this. In the kayfabe era, let's just say from World War II until about the mid 60s. And I'd said earlier, I thought he had a 20-year career. I'm pretty sure it's 24. I think he had a 24 in-ring career. I don't know if that's counting his later few coffee breaks with Ric Flair stuff in the late 70s. The bottom line is, when wrestling history is discussed and you want to talk about the greatest wrestlers of all time, or if you want to talk about the greatest money makers of all time, there could be two different lists here, by the way.
Yeah.
But I think Buddy Rogers has to be on both
Yeah.
of them because
no, without a doubt.
he was a moneymaker. And, you know, and of course, as far as the greatest wrestlers of all time, I think that he folds over. He's on some list of greatest wrestlers. Is he up there
Yeah.
with Lou Thez and Vern Gagne and Pat O'Connor and, you know, a bunch of those others? Probably not, but he's on the list.
Yeah.
And, you know, just a phenomenal talent. And I will point out that generally speaking, Buddy was respected by the promoters overall. He usually was agreeable to work with the promoters. And it was the most fun part, even though it was real on the outside, outside the ring, was the fact that him and Lou had that professional jealousy. But I tell you, Lou did say, and I had this said to me during my conversation with him in 2000 at the Cauliflower. He said, I always appreciated and respected Buddy for his drawing power. Now, that's an under the table compliment. He didn't compliment him as a wrestler, but he did give him credit because Lou knew Lou knew that if he was in the ring with Buddy, hello, payday.
Yeah.
You know?
All right, George, thank you for your insight. Ladies and gentlemen, one more time, Mr. George Schire, talking about the great Buddy Rogers. Thank you so much. Folks, if you're watching, thank you. If you're listening, thank you. If you haven't subscribed, please do so, and we will talk to you soon.